Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Robertson bringing you another video regarding Stormworks Build and Rescue. This time I'll be both replying to a question asked by one of my subscribers as well as addressing an issue that I only briefly touched upon once or twice before in a couple of my channel update videos. And that question comes from my esteemed colleague and long-time follower Simon Reid, who asks, in your video about the improvements you made to the Condor, you mention that the Stormworks devs haven't added any Coast Guard missions and how this is a missed opportunity. What do you mean by that? And can you not add them yourself using the in-game mission editor? Well, to answer your question, we first need to look at what I mean by Coast Guard missions, or even full-blown combat missions for that matter. For those of us that have the weapons DLC, all we can do right now is spawn our creations into the game and have players control each one and make them shoot at each other, for no other reason than just to test things out or to waste time. With regards to long-term weapons DLC content, we do have the Conquest game mode, but that really is a bare-bones basic island hopping campaign with a limited set of options and enemy types that not only gets boring very quickly, but can't really be played at the same time as the career game, as it requires a lot of time and your attention in order to prevent the enemy forces from essentially taking over the map. Now, whether or not this was done intentionally, as something of a marketing ploy to get people hyped up about potential in-game combat, in order to drum up interest in what at the time was their upcoming new game called Carrier Command 2, which essentially does the whole combat and island hopping campaign significantly better than the Stormworks DLC, I might add, or if this was merely just a coincidence, is something that only the developers themselves would be able to answer, although I do have to admit the timing of it all does raise more than a few eyebrows. With all that being said, what we don't have in Stormworks, however, is career-style, randomly generated or player-made missions that involve the weapons DLC. In other words, missions that we can choose to undertake or ignore without it creating a problem further down the career path, as with the default rescue and delivery ones we currently have right now. But Captain, I hear you say, weapons in Stormworks are just for kids, they don't belong in a search and rescue game or with the Coast Guard. Sorry dear viewer, but as anyone here that served in the Coast Guard or their national equivalent will tell you, being armed is an important part of their job. Why? Well, allow me to clarify. You see, Coast Guard missions can be anything from this list I've added, which I'll just display on screen for you now, along with a brief description as to how they could be implemented in the game. First off, we have fishery protection, where you approach a ship that's been spotted fishing illegally somewhere on the map, and when you approach it, either a script or a small radar will detect you coming within a certain range, probably between 50 and 100 meters, making its engine start or engage its clutch and move away from the area, and once it's out of the area it'll trigger a mission success outcome. The next one is drug interdiction. In this mission, a fast-moving speedboat belonging to a well-known smuggler has been spotted somewhere off the coast, and the player must use either an aerial vehicle of some sort, a speedboat or hydrofoil in order to close in on them. In which case, like the previous example, once the player's vehicle gets within a certain distance, the speedboat will come to a complete stop, allowing the player to transport both the smuggler and their contraband to the police station or a military base in order to trigger that the mission has been completed. Now, this one is actually quite a good idea because, like with the fishery protection mission, it doesn't require the player to have the weapons DLC, so you can pretty much do them without even firing a single shot, and it actually lets the players make use of the seldom visited island with the police station, which has both a wooden pier for ships and boats and a helipad for your flying creations. The next mission type that the Coast Guard tends to be involved in is anti-piracy, and now whilst this won't be too familiar to most of my Western viewers, but anyone that's here from Africa, the Middle East, the Far East including Malaysia and the Philippines, and especially Singapore will tell you, piracy is still a very real problem, and both private yachts, commercial tankers and cargo vessels are considered prize targets for the more unscrupulous and desperate individuals over there, and it is quite often the Coast Guard, not just the Navy in those parts of the world, that end up having to deal with those kinds of threats. A good example of a mission like this in Stormworks is one where you have one or two pirate skiffs, or a small fishing motorboat that's modified to have weaponry on it, that have been spotted approaching a commercial vessel just off the coast somewhere. And it's up to the player to use whatever vehicle they feel is most suitable in order to intercept them. This can either be a mission to drive them away if you don't have the weapons DLC, or a search and destroy one if you do. A good example of this is the one that I actually created for the Pegasus Hydrofoil showcase video, so if you've not seen it already, then I definitely recommend watching it to see this in action. And finally, for the more adventurous of you out there, it would be good if we also had the possibility of there being actual combat missions. At least for those of you who have the weapons DLC and are keen to make use of those gunboats, attack helicopters and offshore patrol vessels that you have made, but have just been sitting there collecting dust over the last few years. A good example of this would be a mission like the one being shown on screen right now, where an enemy warship has been spotted raiding commerce in the region and you've been ordered on a mission to search and destroy it before it manages to escape. In other words, before the mission timer runs out. In a mission like this, a simple trigger or script like the one used with the Hebus target drones could be used to detect when the vessel has dropped below an altitude of -20 meters. In other words, it detects that it has sunk. Unless it's a submarine, of course. Alternatively, you could use a script or a trigger that detects when it has received more than a set amount of HP damage, in which case it can make use of the same script from the weapons DLC that creates a large explosion at the same position as the enemy warship before despawning it, which would make it look like the warship itself exploded after taking too much damage. Then, of course, it would just be a case of triggering the mission's success outcome shortly afterwards. Now, these are only a few examples of what could be included, just to give players a little more variety to the base game and let us actually make use of the weapons that came with the DLC, without forcing us to take part in that rather disappointing Conquest game mode. And as I've said in a previous video, I feel that they would be extremely popular and not only keep people interested in playing Stormworks for longer, but also attract more people to the game itself and the respective DLC. Yes, Captain, but why don't you just make those yourself, I hear you say? Well, my friends, I wish I could, but sadly, despite being an experienced VBS instructor with more than 15 years experience making training exercises and scenarios for both VBS and the Armed Assault series, as well as being the author of the popular Sentinel mission pack for Stormworks back in 2019, I am actually struggling all to hell with the Lewis scripting required to make even a basic mission nowadays in Stormworks Build and Rescue. You see, before version 1.0 it was actually relatively easy to make a player-made mission in Stormworks. We had the ability to add zones, set reward and mission completion conditions in the editor without the need for any Lewis scripting. For example, in this screen here from an older version of Stormworks, you can see a list of the characters, objects and vehicles used in the playlist being moved over into the mission so that they're able to be linked to objectives and zones in the mission itself. And on the next screen, you can see the actual window and drop-down menu used for creating the objectives. Unfortunately, the functionality that you see here was removed after version 1.0 of Stormworks, which I can only assume was done to make it more simpler for the devs to use, as well as to make more use of the powerful Lewis scripting. And I was hoping that the old interface was going to reappear again over the last few years, but sadly, that has not been the case. In fact, the problem that we face now is that most of the missions that you can now find on the Steam Workshop that have objectives tend to be for the older version of Stormworks that used this mission editor, which means that they won't work anymore. Whilst the ones we tend to see now, for the most part anyway, are just for spawning in creations that are too big for the workbench or are player-made static structures. Unfortunately, this is where I feel that the developers have let the player base down, and indeed the whole content creation community. And don't take this the wrong way, as this isn't a dig at the developers directly, as they have done some absolutely truly stellar work over the last few years. This is just some constructive criticism coming from a professional that uses mission editors and other such software on more or less a day-to-day basis, both for fun and as part of their work. And, I hate to say this guys, but as it stands right now, the Stormworks Build and Rescue Mission Editor is probably one of the most user-unfriendly applications I have ever dealt with, especially when it comes to trying to create even a basic scenario requiring rescue or delivery objectives, let alone combat-orientated ones. One of the biggest pitfalls for anyone trying to use it, at least in my experience, is the requirement of the user to have an intermediate to advanced level of knowledge in Lua scripting just to get a mission to function adequately, including objectives being completed and rewarding the player when it's done. Now, whilst I certainly appreciate the fact that the devs have included a brief guide that's filled with examples of the kind of callbacks, functions and matrices that you can use, it's been done in a way that tells rather than shows the player how to do it. Especially for someone that's not very experienced with Lua scripting or even coding in general. And I suspect that it was created by someone who is exceptionally comfortable with Lua scripting or has a natural aptitude for it, rather than by someone with experience trying to explain it to your average everyday gamer or content creator, as even I myself struggle to understand what it is they're trying to explain, let alone use it. For example, if we look at the section of script from the default AI folder that allocates a certain amount of HP to a vehicle based on its size, and then starts a timer once it receives damage exceeding that amount, or sinks below -20 meters, then this is exactly the sort of thing that I'd love to be able to use in my own missions. The only problem is, whilst I understand what it's trying to do, I unfortunately don't have the knowledge or experience to be able to implement it correctly for myself, using the mission editor. And goodness knows I've tried, and whilst I'm sure the small percentage of people who are well versed in computer code out there are probably going, "Oh hey Captain, I know exactly how to do that, what are you complaining about?" I strongly suspect that about 90% of the other people watching this, and who play Stormworks, are probably just as confused by it as I am. Which, going back, is one of the reasons why the only two good mission packs we have on the Steam Workshop right now tend to belong to gifted coders such as Snake21JPN and Zizo. And as talented as they are, even they haven't been able to implement Coast Guard or low-intensity combat missions, which suggests that the ability to do so is even out with their skill level. Likewise, when you see just how extremely popular Zizo's complete mission pack is on the Steam Workshop, then you'll realise that there really is quite a high demand for more missions in the Stormworks community right now. And I feel that this demand has only been partly addressed by the devs with the addition of a few more randomised missions over the last few years that have come along with the base game in one or two of their larger updates, such as the underwater one. But ideally, I think most of us would still like the ability to be able to quickly and easily create many of those ourselves. Especially if the devs feel that the lion's share of their attention is best directed elsewhere, such as on the upcoming Space DLC or the new IP that they're currently working on. If possible, what I would like to see implemented in the Stormworks Mission Editor is the kind of user-friendly functionality that we had in Stormworks prior to version 1.0, including the drop-down menus and the ability to easily add objectives and triggers on the fly. Or alternatively, something that allows us to make use of the VBS and ARMA style plug and play drop in and linkable triggers that you can attach to objects, vehicles or characters that have a small drop down menu or even a box allowing you to select a particular function or type in a few lines of code, essentially giving the player the ability to set a vehicle's maximum damage HP, detect whether or not the entity is still alive, in other words present in the game world or not, or fallen below a certain altitude, etc. Then set the relevant despawning, win and lose conditions along with what reward to give the player upon mission success. Adding a mission randomizer or shuffle toggle and an adjustable timer function to the mission playlist would also be extremely useful to us. Now, these are just some very basic suggestions to how I feel the mission editor could be improved, as ideally it should be as user-friendly as possible, as this will allow the average gamer out there the ability to make even a basic search and rescue or Coast Guard style mission, without the need for a college diploma on Lua scripting, whilst at the same time allowing the functionality to make further improvements to the mission for those that are well versed in said code. Because, ladies and gentlemen, when all is said and done, at the end of the day, a game like Stormworks Build and Rescue should be primarily aimed at actual gamers, and not just coders. Anyway, I think that about covers everything for this video. As always, I look forward to seeing what everyone's thoughts are on this. Do you agree or disagree? And if so, please let us know why in the comment section below. Once again, I'd like to close by thanking all of my followers, viewers and subscribers out there, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. So, until then, this is Captain Robertson, signing off.